please put meaning in your interpretations. Meaning is transcendence. Meaning is understanding the civilization which created the artwork which you're serving. That doesn't sound so universal and so unreachable as a goal compared to the technique of playing it right according to the edition of the recordings or the teacher. In other words, play the right notes. As it's the minimum expected, but it's the means, not the end. And the curiosity that you have to search for the analytical understanding, but also combined with your intuitive calling for it. Bettering your ear, therefore your hearing. Combining it with your reading of the music, the deduction, the reaction and the reflection of this or that edition, this or this available manuscript, and compare the meaning of the thought process of the composer, why this note comes after the next, and how this thought branches off this way, and what is the purpose of a repeat, and how do we organize it in the meaning of the flow of the events by the pulse and the tempo. These are not choices that are made out of comparison because there are availability of plethora of recordings or performances to compare from and choose from, like in a supermarket for consumer society where you choose this or that brand. You can develop a certain acquired taste as well as an informed awareness as a consumer why you go to a product or another. But the choices of the thought process of putting the meaning in your interpretation, this is something that should be keeping you awakened all the time. It's not about reaching a competitive goal among your peers or to compare the interpretations of performers before your time, which also put in competition, because these are the tips of the iceberg. What motivates these interpretations is hidden under the water of the giant icebergs. The root causes which bring you to make those choices. And the reason for which this is a process of self-bettering is because you need to open your culture and your curiosity to learn the universe of the music which you play within the context of its cultural and historic background, and going focused more on the given composer's work you play is study, learn, listen attentively, or immerse rather even yourself in other works of this composer for various genres if they exist, such as symphonic, operatic, ballet, chamber music, and if you play the solo piece, and see how that piece of the puzzle of this composer's creative expression of their own sense of humanity, of the trace they left from their being on earth through the few notes that they left on the paper, which you resuscitate either with the help of a teacher, either by your own intuition, or contradicting the one or completing with the other, and in fact filtering through different options what different ways of, or whatever different meanings these pieces might have for different people who already have lived through the life of a musician with experience. And so you'll say, okay, I'll filter this, I'll take that, perhaps I'll keep it for later, but for now, I have a short-term goal, which is an exam, a jury, an audition, performance, and then I have to find the equation of this absolute search for the transcendence of the meaning of the interpretation. Therefore, what is the meaning of this work in the context of its era, within that very short-term goal? And I think that the skill that one has to have in terms of technical approach is usually taught very early when detected or obliged with very young children to, let's say, learn an instrument. So is it more about going from the crowd to the elite? Is it about forging something as a taste that has to be acquired in order to reach a necessity, and then through competitivity try to prove that you are best by others who will define it for you, filtered by juries from childhood onwards? And so it's mostly exams than competitions, but regardless, there is the time that it takes to learn a piece, to mature a piece, to perform a piece, to memorize a piece, to appropriate the meaning of the piece, the details of the piece, not just as a recitation because it's written and I have to just say it even if I don't know really what it says, or I know it in general ideas because it's sort of guessable if it's major or minor, happy, sad, anything very superficial. But even if we get more subtle in the transcendence of the message, then you start thinking, perhaps there is something I would like to understand in that gesture of an interval, in that gesture of the expression that is the rhetoric of the statement. And it's not just taken out of context in order to be played, since the instrument, the piano in this case, is unfortunately too easy to start, since you don't have to define the pitch and nor the length of the sound in terms of prolonging it with vibrato and giving it a connection to the next note. In other words, articulation, elocution, you don't have to deal with the enunciation of the words. And therefore, you have to imagine words according to similar melodic gestures in operatic arias or in songs. And therefore, immersing yourself in accompaniment of art songs through poetry brings you closer to understand the meaning of an era in which you would play, for instance, a Schumann piano piece compared to a Schumann lied, and the French art song of Fauré compared to the music of the French symbolism around Debussy, Ravel, and many more. And you realize that then you can travel through history and discover lesser known composers from cultures that didn't have a classical music tradition from Renaissance onwards, like, for instance, or even earlier, like Italy, Germany. Compared to, let's say, countries which appeared independent after falls of empires at the end of the 19th century in Europe, or countries outside of the European tradition or Western European tradition of the music, such as the Gregorian chant, the polyphony, the fugue, the pure music, the form, the early Viennese school, all these forms of idealization of the organization of the sounds as a metaphor of the organization of the world, or the colonization of man of others, therefore of nature itself, by organizing through architecture and through landscaping and agriculture and everything, industrialization. And you reach the point where the music is the, of course, reflection and the, I would say, even the theatric representation of art, through art of life itself, or what are the beliefs, what are the hopes, what are the fears, religious or aesthetic, because of that, understanding how you place a music not only functionally, because not all sacred music is only sacred profane music is sacred in its own way. It depends what you place in that word, how you understand the meaning of things. In other words, you have to be cultivated in order to learn not only the grammar, to speak the language that you received at birth through your ears as the mother tongue, but not to be limited to only the oral expression, because then you cannot perhaps put down your thoughts and therefore refine your thinking and reach the point of the contradiction from which you reach a certain meaning of things through thought process, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And therefore, understanding the urge of organization of music in terms of its production, its distribution, its spreading, its education, its learning, its place as an accompaniment for dance or accompaniment for singing, or just on its own without lyrics, which even in modern or nowadays tradition of popular music, non-musicians always assume that music is with lyrics, and therefore without lyrics is sort of like, is it a song or is it a piece? The concepts already are confused. It's like as if you confuse poetry and prose. It's something to know. We don't know it intuitively, or perhaps you guess it by the sounds of the words chosen, the organization of the number of syllables and how you organize your stanzas. So then you cultivate yourself to understand the purpose of this piece within this context. But then again, if you're only taught since very young how to develop your skill in order to be competitive the earliest possible in terms of playing the right notes in the fastest or effective speed rather, in order to impress people who think your dexterity on the keyboard is superior to the dexterity of another at the same age or earlier, and it becomes arms race, as they used to call it in the Cold War, where there is no end, except you accumulate more arms. In the same way, you accumulate more competitions, more disappointments of people who don't win the competitions, but more people through more schools getting ready and other teachers to prepare them to compete among themselves through greater numbers coming in like waves and waves and waves. And this democratization of attending a high level of technical skill masks very often, unfortunately, the fact that the happy few who will produce a meaningful interpretation that will mark the industry, as they call it, or I would say rather the history of a performance of a given masterpiece universally accepted as such, revisited through your personal intuition, intelligence, culture, and that is so important ingredient, as well as of course the capacity to deliver it, because there is no art without technique. But technique becomes very early the only end by itself, since it takes so long and so repetitively to be acquired in order to be reliable on unreliable circumstances of the human psyche in different situations, of instruments, the pianos being differently responding to your touch according to their different weight of the keyboard keys, acoustics, and many reasons for which you have to sort of repaint the painting from scratch, because as soon as you finish playing the piece, it vanished. Okay, you can record it, that's true today, I mean, since a century and a half or more. But the essence of a performance is to be ephemeral compared to a painting, for instance, that doesn't erase itself from the canvas. When you go to a certain gallery, you don't have to repaint it in front of each new guest who is visiting it. And here, when you have to replay the piece which you learn how to perform, you have to reinitiate it from scratch. So in a way, you become a temporary recomposer of the piece in the eye of the listener, because most of the time the composer is dead. Therefore, the work by itself represents itself more even the composer. It's the work that people like: the melodic, the harmonic, the rhythmic, the enticing, the heroism, the sense of sadness or the sense of reflection, the polyphony, which is difficult to follow, let less to play, because you have to divide your thoughts and multiply your attentions, while the beauty of it being also the representation of a certain aesthetic of the Western civilization in Europe from many centuries ago. And it's a different from the monodic and the folkloric and the ear tradition transmission of music through oral tradition transmission, as it's in many countries. And it's valuable in its own great ethnomusicological quality. But when you come from a country that has a different tradition or culture or of a certain genre or instrumental performance or specific time period, specific, let's say, niche in the given time period's composing experience, for instance, you can very well consider that playing on the modern piano a piece by a Renaissance composer and modern music is in a way completely a loss in translation, that you need to have the instruments and therefore the know-how how to play them in order to guess how it used to be played when it wasn't recorded and not much defined, other than through the people who played it on the spot and taught it through their own experience by playing it. And people traveled less and lived short and developed little awareness of the music of their own past, since there was very little availability to go to it. And in a way, today we have this universal, in the 21st century, for music studies approach of time periods that we have to sort of survey, as they call it, but in fact on the surface. And then you play a piece that you have to learn how to play. So how do you put it in order to understand its harmonic structure, if it has such, its polyphonic structure, if it has such, in terms of the layering of the voices versus the pulse, the rhythm, the notation, and what it means or what it doesn't bring to understand, or how come it differs from what you read when you hear it. Have you not read it before you heard it? And so you enter into these details, which ultimately make you lose the whole picture, because you wonder, I will never have the time to study the history of music, the music theory of music, the technique of playing the music, then the piece itself. But in fact, while I say this, and it can appear discouraging because of the lack of time that people always use as a good excuse, in fact, I think that at the very pedestrian level of piano playing and learning and comparing and exploring and then trying to perform at best a piece, they have to define what is the best. And the best is not only to play it clean and reliably so, with appropriate fingerings for your own morphology of the hand, and then be able to organize your hearing about the pedalization, about what is a harmonic pedalization versus a melodic pedalization, since you only have one keyboard for both. Therefore, you have to hear the texture within the reading of the notes, besides of how you heard it other playing them. And I think that if you write it down, you start understanding better how the composer organized the thoughts. He composed the notes literally, not only the first and the last, but all in between. And of course, in free improvisation, you only know the beginning and you openly prefer not to know the end, just the metaphor of life, when and how. But in a written composition, which is a finished ecosystem, which you start learning, you already know how it's going to end. So you will really work in the memorization of the format of the piece, then the very details of how it's organized, the transitions, the modulations, the tonalities, where it goes through, etc. In other words, all these skills of how to play should be at the very early age, when taught how to mechanically organize the independence of fingers and organize, which are naturally not independent and naturally not even, in order to play evenly, if that is what is required, or unevenly, in order to organize the articulation. In other words, you have to put some grammar in the mother tongue in order to be able to write and read by your own intellect, and not only by the administration of what the teacher decides, or how the trends of the comparison with all the others brings you to competitively want to play. It's not the length, the tempo, it's not slower, better, or faster, less, or the opposite. It is a lot more about understanding what is in between the notes, and what are the affects, where are the appoggiaturas, where the harmonization leads you to a punctuation, what type of cadence it is, regardless what you call it. Deceptive cadence in French is a cadence rompue, broken, like a broken promise. Deception means something about lying, or putting you in a position where you expect something you don't get, which is the resolution of the dominant to the tonic, while the leading tone goes to the tonic, but you might go to the sixth degree as a delay tactic. Once you understand that, then you organize yourself about thinking, will I always use the intuitive tension release of the leading tone to the tonic, or will I not, in order to go further and then go to my final punctuation? Of course, I like to map the ideas of the thoughts by giving alternative options when I teach to a student of a given section of a given piece, where the possible question is, Professor, what do I bring out in this section? Or what does that mean there? I understand perhaps the theme, but this transition. And it's a very important and honest question to address very subtly, because you want, as a teacher, to bring, and that's my conviction, not the intuition away from the understanding which should replace it, rather combine it and say you love it because you don't know, but it could be in part of these ingredients. And these ingredients by themselves don't make the piece, because that's the mystery of the creation. And if you can logically organize your thoughts of understanding what you play, you can say, oh, this pattern leads to this, and logically the composer should do this. But imagine if there is no completion for one or another reason of a given score, and you have to do it. What do you do then? By assumption and by cultivated knowledge of the different pieces of the composer in the given style, you can come up with an alternative option of what it could have been. But even when you guess it by logical deduction or by intuitive inspiration, by immersion in the given style of the composer, you feel like you can just mimic few more notes if they're missing to complete the dots. When you see sometimes the written work as it is, completed by the composer with their choices, or their choices to not keep everything and pure, to get to the essence of things, then you realize that you're often surprised by their choices. And therefore, a composer doesn't have to satisfy your logical expectation. In other words, it's like retro-engineering, or rather reverse engineering, I meant. A piece which was already composed from scratch, and you play it already written. Therefore, you try to retrace how the thought process of the composer led it to there. from this point to the next, basically sort of a GPS of the DNA of the piece. It's a bit of an archaeology research about defining what could have motivated the choice in order to capture from this large universal curiosity that you have towards what you love, which you like to serve, therefore play, therefore try to understand how you're going to make each of the phrases coexist. Which bridges where, which goes further, which concludes. How do you organize the pacing according to this? How do you stretch the tempo before reaching a point where it's syllabic or spelling bee like word by letter of the words into the sentences, into the then of course paragraphs and pages and book. In other words, the micro and the macro are very important to be always thought at the same time. You have to be picky, precise for the detail, and organizing your thoughts for the whole. And I think that memorization is a process through, of course, for some, a combination of visual or audio memory, just like the mother tongue, right? But at the same time, the tones organized in a way by the composer puzzle or excite, and then you try to understand how you place this phrasing in that meaning of this style. Is it romantic? Is it classic? Is it baroque? As we define it today for convenience. Of course, most composers overlap these because they didn't think about fitting in our categorization so neatly. But it gives a sense of organization, since now we study so much more the music of the past than the people in the past did. And therefore, it gives us a certain guideline. But of course, then the more you get to know, the more subtly you understand that things are not so clearly cut. But let's say, take the Romantic era that saw the development industrially of the instrument with the metallic frame and the strings that now, of course, are steel. Before they used to be gut. The cost-strung pianos that allow to resonate even when you don't play certain notes, so that the ranges are no more separate in their color or timbre like an orchestra, woodwinds, brass strings. But you have this homogeneous capacity of this symphonic approach of the piano, which led sonatas by Beethoven to lead to sonatas by Chopin, which led to the sonata by Liszt, which led to the sonata by Schumann, to go through the sonata by Brahms. And in between they wrote, of course, not only sonata form pieces, but this Romantic era in Germany of the 18th century, going into the fulfillment of it, full blossoming in the 19th century, was also the representation of the individual in the society versus the group. In a concerto for piano and orchestra is a metaphor, or the heroism of the soldier or the heroism of the hero sacrificing themselves for a cause, would it be a country, a religion, a woman, or love in general, and the idealization of that longing for the hope to be loved or to be victorious or to be successful at all levels of human expectation. And this Romantic era was the era of the longing, and the poetry came from that longing, and the writing about it for the love longing. The same thing with the interpretation of these pieces, where while they represent an extract of humanity in their experience, you don't see always the philosophy of the Greeks or the understanding of the Cartesian philosophy from France of the age of the Enlightenment. But it is somewhere embedded in it. It's part of the ingredients. And it doesn't make you a better performer because you're informed and let's say scholarly cultivated. But if you study philosophy and you study history and you study or you're curious in these topics, then you realize that it's a bottomless pit. Of course, that's the first thing. But the human experience is to accumulate an understanding while keeping a very intense affect, the emotion, the meaning, why this meant so much to a human being who was probably suffering their own illness, not to mention wars, not to mention famine, and not to mention all kinds of horrible things that happen in humanity constantly. Sorry, I hit accidentally the keys on the piano against which I'm leaning, which you cannot see in the screen now. And at the same time, they extract the best of humanity from them. Is it a hope? Is it a message? Is it a bottle, as they call it, message in the bottle in the ocean, so to say, metaphorically, to us? And what does it mean to us today outside of this, of their context, but in our context? That was music, perhaps, and poetry and painting and religious hopes and fears and organization of society vertically and all kinds of situations in which they evolved, but left us something intemporal, something universal, but it's totally rooted in their own reality. And all of a sudden, out of centuries of distance, it becomes so preciously meaningful to our psyche, to our intellect, to our very being when we are involved in piano music, classical music. It's not a museum item of the past that we play. It's something very real and present that we practice over and over repetitively in order to play it at its best, because we don't want to mess it up, because we don't want to appear to be unable to serve it at the level of its inspiration, which elevates us in turn by this transcendence. And I find that in that self-betterment, we find a certain meaning. And beyond that, it can be also disappointment and discouragements, given the amount of people who can learn it perhaps faster and more effective. And it is not about competing with others, it's competing with yourself. That said, it's still also within competing with others. I am not unaware of that. And I'm trying to nourish and nurture the hopes of the individual destinies of pianists who come by to study with me for a given time of their lives. And I feel like sometimes I'm in a triage line for them to choose how to go where from there. It's not a direct direction. I don't decide for them, but I think that I try to help them reach their short-term goals with ingredients of their long-term yearnings, how to reach to them. And sometimes it is discouraging if I say, you will play this sonata very well in 20 years, while you'll be very effective in few weeks. It doesn't mean that one cancels the other or the one discourages the other option. The contrary, I think it should be an encouragement, because then you'll see through life, as I like to say, it's a companion, the piece through life. And it becomes a gift that keeps on giving. And of course, you have to scratch the surface in the beginning, and then you get further deep in it. And you can reject the way you understood it or you were taught it, or perhaps say, hey, now I know, which is normal. That's human. And I would say that I don't pretend to own any truth, or because of my experience in music for so many decades, that I know the right from the wrong. I can give these guidelines for students who seek it. But I still help them, because I hope, that's how I made this complicated mouth sound, confused rather. Hope to bring them how to choose by themselves the way to express the things. And of course, the heroism of the Western European romanticism was the individualism. And when you have, let's say, had a childhood where you were part of a group, of a society, of a country, of a people, the individualism is often erased as a yearning, but then it cannot be artificially stamped because of a piece. You don't just play notes, you play the meaning of these notes. And so it helps to open yourself nowadays, even if only clicks away, through the artworks of the time. Of course, you have to learn the history of the time, but the wars don't teach you as much other than strategically for the great transhumance of humans and how things happened to evolve between these and these dynasties of these and these rulers who ruled the lives of all those people. And some of these people left us something that represents so beautifully humanity, and this represented by a few scratches on paper by a given composer at some time, who perhaps had no clue that it would be so meaningful to somebody 2-3 centuries later. But it is, isn't it beautiful? And so you spend your time practicing in order to learn how to play it best. You have to be able to understand that the skill is the hyphen that is necessary between your inspiration or your motivation and the completion of the meaning of what you do. And if people disagree by telling you it's not supposed to be like that, or it's too fast, it's too slow, it's too loud, it's too soft, don't do this, too much pedal, not enough pedal, rubato, not enough rubato, all the kind of ingredients that you can then define in quantity and quality by the culture that you acquire through studying. Ultimately, I try to think, it's another of these, think not to sink. It's exactly what I wanted to say, but my thoughts collided in the words together. In the complexity of the universalism of this approach, that you sink in the hopelessness that it's never going to be achieved in the short time I have, the finitude of our lives compared to the eternity, or apparent so, of the infinity of time in times is mind-boggling. So thoughtfully we go back to our daily immediate situation and we keep a part of eternity in everything we do every day. And we are in dialogue, sort of imaginary dialogue, with the thoughts and the feelings of the composers whom we play. Hey, Ludwig, how did you think of this? Why not that? And it's not about being arrogant and questioning the masterpiece, not at all. It's really about a sense of belonging to the piece you play. And you feel like in the process, you develop a kinship, like you do with a novel, like you do with a film, like you do with any artwork of fiction, or perhaps fictionalizing the reality, which becomes then the symbol of love, of death, of hope, of whatever it is, variations of the love of life, yearning of the human soul. You define the soul through this religion or not. You define the definition of ambition, hope, and aesthetic. You define, in fact, you frame constantly the meaning of what you do, but you're not always aware of it because you're told that you don't have time to think about it. Let them learn first how to play the piece. We'll teach them later what it means, the form, the tonal system, if there is one, or different type, modal or polytonal or perhaps serial. In other words, I think that it's possible, and I think it's necessary to inculcate both at the same time, the substance and the substantive. And that the form of the artwork that we serve is part of the artwork we serve. Understanding it doesn't help you play it. It understands you, put the meaning in why you play it and how you want to play it from point A to point B. And once you're away from only being able to do it by comparison or by imitation, then little by little you forge your own meaning of the piece. And perhaps you have to question yourself and those who tell you about it until you reach that point. I find it to be the most respectful exchange of humanity with a student. Not just that expected or supposed, and sometimes hopefully induced only by the value of the work, not by the attitude of the teacher knowing and the student not knowing, being in one direction only. I think this asymmetrical approach is necessary, and within there is an exchange, not between the student and the teacher in the two directions while it happens, but the two with the score of the music itself. So in fact, the teachers and the students try to better the dialogue with the composer's thought. And then the skill of how to manage it is what I hope to help my students reach for their own means and their own morphology, as I said. So I wanted to make sure that this approach is not considered superfluous or unnecessary or a loss of time, loss of competitivity. I think it is something that nourishes the capacity of the musician beyond the prime age, beyond the early adulthood, beyond the middle adulthood, into the early old age and into the very old age, to remain always motivated in the capacity to shine through their own search for this yearning and search. To their students, to their audiences, to the chamber music partners, with whom music is shared, and of course, ultimately, with the audience. Their own culture, their own understanding or expectations, and your own input into what you do. I believe in humanity.